Why does the United States enter World War I? Why does the United States get involved? If this war begins in Europe, why does the United States find itself in the war? Well, over the course of American history, since the beginning of the creation of the United States in 1776, the United States and United States politicians had been keen to keep themselves out of entanglements with other countries. In fact, George Washington, in his farewell speech, said as much, basically said, beware of foreign entanglements. So the United States had not really been involved. The United States was separated by giant oceans. There wasn't really any reason for the United States to get involved in, say, the affairs of Europe. So the question is, why get involved? There's a lot of reasons for the United States not to get involved. And in fact, when the war first starts in 1914, the United States does not enter the war at all. And in fact, many of the European powers believe the war is going to be really short. So the United States sees no reason to mobilize its armed forces and to go over there because it's far away and the war would probably be over pretty fast. In any case, and also in 1914, as the war starts to drag on, the US still stays out and does not enter the war until 1917. And one of the reasons is the United States generally saw Europe as a very volatile kind of tinderbox. The experience from the perspective of 1914 for the United States is that Europe was violent and often in a great state of flux. So there wasn't any real reason for the United States to go get involved in a war. There had been wars, the Crimean War in the 1850s, the Franco-Prussian War in the 1870s. And these wars had not involved the United States. The United States has sort of looked at them from afar, and there wasn't ever any question of the United States getting involved. And similarly, the United States saw probably the same set of events here. Also, the United States had friendly relations with both sides. We have to remember that while the war is often thought of as a war between, say, Germany and France, or Germany and the UK, or between Germany, France, the UK, and Russia, there were a lot of, the United States is a rather ethnically diverse country, even in the beginning of the 20th century. Many German Americans, many Irish Americans, many Anglo-Americans. So the idea of getting involved on one side or the other, there was the danger, or was the fear of the danger of internal dissension based on which side one would support. So the United States wanted to have friendly relations with both sides, and also the United States wanted to make money. The United States wanted to trade with both sides and didn't really want to get involved. The conflict was believed to be short. Another thing is that there's generally something, while the United States, in between this earlier Crimean War and, this earlier Franco-Prussian War and World War I, the United States had started to become a world power, had started becoming imperial power by, for instance, in the Spanish-American War and in other events. So the United States was not a country that was unopposed to getting involved in wars overseas. But the idea was that the United States was not going to get involved in any war that was not for their own interest. The Spanish-American War was clearly for their own interest. The United States then had some degree of control over Cuba, as well as Puerto Rico and the Philippines. But in the case of World War I, the idea was that the United States could stay apart from the rest of the world and really kind of had immunity from that. And the United States was an exceptional country because of its geographic situation. There was no reason for them to get involved. Well, the US doesn't stay neutral. This ends pretty fast. And one of the reasons for this is that geographically, if you look at a map, Britain began to block any sort of US trade to Germany. Most trade from the United States to Germany, in fact, all trade, would go through the English Channel, and in order to get to Germany. So in blocking the English Channel, Britain effectively blocked any US trade to Germany. And the US moves closer and closer to the side of the Triple Entente. The United States had in the first, say, 100 years of US existence, had some degree of camaraderie or good feelings at various times to both England and France. In the early part of United States history, England and France, the United States had kind of played off whether they would be allied with one or the other. But by the end of the 19th century, United States is generally an ally of England or France. And so they moved closer to them as the war dragged on. Another thing which really moved the United States closer to an alliance with England and France was that Germany, one of the technological innovations that Germany had done in the had undergone in their industrialization since their unification in the 1870s, was that Germany had started to construct a lot of submarines, then called U-boats. These U-boats were sent out into the Atlantic, and they were ordered by the Germans to target any ships that were flying Allied flags. So these U-boats would go and they'd sink French vessels and they'd sink English vessels. Now, the United States at the beginning is not part of this alliance. However, the United States does have a lot of passengers on ships that are flying British flags that are crossing the Atlantic. One of them was the SS Lusitania, a massive ship which took passengers as well as freight across the Atlantic. In May 1915, German U-boats torpedoed the Lusitania off the coast of Ireland and sunk the ship, killing almost 1,200 people, many of them women and children. 128 of them were Americans. So in this sinking of this one ship, 128 Americans died. In the American press and in the United States, this firmly turned most of the United States public against the Germans. They were called barbarians. Many of the American newspapers were really taking a lot of British newspaper propaganda and perspectives at the time and adopting them as their own. And so, because it's in the same language, and so many of these newspapers in the United States started a drumbeat against Germany in any case, if not necessarily a drumbeat for war. Remember, this is May 1915, just a few months after the start of, less than a year after the start of the conflict in Europe. But opposition still remained. Remember, you still had those internal divisions inside the United States, those ethnic divisions, and you still had the aspect that there really didn't seem necessarily a great reason why, even though 128 Americans had died in this torpedoing, that there would be any reason why the United States would go and spend millions upon millions upon millions of dollars sending hundreds of thousands of soldiers over to Europe for what was still seen, certainly in May 1915, as a European problem. What happens afterwards is that Germany, after the sinking of the Lusitania, actually ends unrestricted submarine warfare. Woodrow Wilson, the president at the time, communicated as such to Germany, and Germany ended this practice because it was seen as turning public opinion, certainly in the United States, against Germany, and so Germany abandons its unrestricted submarine warfare practice, which was one of the reasons why the Lusitania was targeted. Wilson, on the other hand, though, although they don't go to war, starts to order the U.S. Army and Navy to build up, to really start to shore up a lot of, to build more armaments, build more boats, and start to prepare for the possibility that the U.S. would have to enter the war in Europe. Congress passes a National Defense Act, which authorized the government to take over factories and businesses that needed to be used in the prosecution of a war. So if they needed to take a particular factory over that was making one thing and take that factory over so that it could make war armaments, that was passed by Congress. And you start to have the birth of this close marriage in the American economy and government between the American government and American business in the prosecution of war. After World War II, we're going to find that military-industrial complex never really disappears after the buildup after World War II. After World War I, it does kind of go down and go away for a bit. But during World War I, you start to see the beginning of this, at least in 1915, 1916, as the US starts to prepare for war. So why, finally, does the US end up, quote unquote, bad example here, but pulling the trigger to enter the Great War? Well, remember, 1916 is a presidential election year. There's never, US presidents generally don't run on a platform of, I'm going to get the United States into a war. during a presidential election, and this is just a general sort of statement, presidents often don't want to commit to doing one or the other. And in 1916, there's no war candidate. Woodrow Wilson is not running on a platform of starting a war and does not want to be seen as that war candidate. So, but interestingly, early 1917, right after Woodrow Wilson takes his second oath of office, the US does enter the conflict. Well, why? Well, one thing is that German U-boats begin to return to the Atlantic. They begin to start to sink Allied shipping again and begin to become a threat to American shipping. So this has started up again, this unrestricted submarine warfare. And then the main trigger for the start of the war, and the main trigger for the start of the United States entry into the war, is going to be something called the Zimmermann telegram. In early 1917, a telegram is intercepted that is sent from Germany through New York, I believe, to the Mexican ambassador. And it basically is an offer to Mexico that says to Mexico, if you support us in our war effort, and if you attack the United States, we will, and we win the war, we will give you any of your territorial claims that Mexico may have lost in the Mexican War in the 1850s, including parts of Arizona, New Mexico, et cetera. This telegram, you might think this is kind of a ridiculous offer. I mean, it is hard to imagine Mexico having the kind of military might to actually move into the southwestern United States. But there was some precedent for this in that there were events going on the US-Mexican border right around 1916, 1917, which seemed like they were a prelude to war. In fact, anti-Mexican sentiment during 1916 and 1917, during those years, was rather high. A revolutionary named Pancho Villa was going across the US border, which is quite ill-defined at the time, going across the US border and attacking towns, and specifically attacked a town called Columbus in New Mexico. And these raids on these towns had turned a lot of sentiment against Mexico. Now, Pancho Villa wasn't necessarily an emissary of the US government, an emissary of the Mexican government or an actual representative of them, but nevertheless, there was this enmity towards Mexico at the time. And so this was a sensitive topic. Wilson actually sent down General Pershing, who later would be the head of American expeditionary forces in Europe. He'd actually sent him to the border to try to find and capture Pancho Villa in 1917. Well, Wilson then, after he comes into power and after the Zimmermann telegram and after all of this, asks Congress for a declaration of war. This was really the last straw, the fact that Germany would actually seek to abandon any notion of neutrality and try to get this neighbor on America's southern border to fight against them. This was seen as a direct provocation towards the United States and a direct sort of active war against United States territory, even though the idea of this actually ever happening in any sense that it would result in the surrender of US territory to Mexico, again, seems fanciful and was very unlikely then. But even just the act of asking Mexico to effect a war against the United States on behalf of Germany really incensed many Americans who were already quite upset about the sinking of the Lusitania and had been affected by a lot of anti-German propaganda in those years after the start of the war. So on April 6, 1917, United States declares war on Germany for the first time, because of course in 1941, the United States will declare war on Germany again. And with that, the United States enters World War I, starts to build up its forces and starts to call up hundreds of thousands of US soldiers to go to Europe. Just one element of this to conclude, the call up of all of these men and the training of all of these men would take quite a long time. Most of these soldiers would not arrive in Europe really until 1918. And at which point they have such a dramatic effect on the war and they actually end up being just the right amount of troops at the right time when both sides in Europe are exhausted after 4 years of a terrible conflict. these it's the United States, this infusion of fresh troops in 1918, which really causes the end of the war and the armistice. And that is why the United States enters World War One.